Good day everyone and welcome to episode 10 of the Mahabharata as is podcast. This podcast explores each and every chapter of the Mahabharata text, which is the biggest epic in human history. In this episode, we will discuss the 6th section of the Mahabharata story. This section is titled Adi-vamshavatrana Parva and is part of the larger Adi-Parva. This Parva is the continuation of the story from Astika Parva. If you're new to this podcast, I suggest you go back to hear the earlier episodes or at least listen to the second half of the episode 9, which summarizes the story from episode 1 through to episode 9. Finally, before we begin, depending upon the platform where you're listening to this podcast, please feel free to leave me a comment, question or feedback. Alternatively, you can drop me an email at mahabharataasas@outlook.com. Please like, subscribe and share if you find this podcast useful. So in last episode, we heard about the snake sacrifice and how it was stopped midway through by sage Astika. In this Parva, the scene is still the same, that is, we are still in the snake sacrifice. The Parva tells us that the snake sacrifice which King Janmejaya organized was also attended by Krishna Dvaipayana Veda Vayasa, who, according to the text itself, is the composer of the actual story. When Veda Vyasa arrives at the ceremony of Janmejaya, the king welcomes him with utmost respect and honors him as one should honor his elder. It is important to remember here that Veda Vyasa, in addition to being the composer of the text, was also an important character of the story. Although his appearance is limited to a handful of scenes, but trust me, there is no story if he hadn't shown up at the crucial point. He acted as a surrogate father for King Dhritarashtra, Pandu and Vidur. From Dhritarashtra were born Kauravas and from Pandu the Pandavas. The Mahabharata war that we know happened between Kauravas and Pandavas. One of the Pandava brothers by the name of Arjuna had a son whose name was Abhimanyu, and Abhimanyu died in the Mahabharata war. Abhimanyu had a son named Parikshit. Now if you recall, we heard the story of Parikshit in episode 8. As you know, Janmejaya was Parikshit's son. So this is what is happening here. Janmejaya is actually meeting the grandfather of his great-grandfather. If you want to pause here and rewind a minute, you will be clear about this small family tree. Now you might ask, how is that possible? Many scholars believe that this Parva is a later interpolation into the text and is therefore slightly inconsistent with the main story. Others argue that Veda Vyasa did not attend the snake sacrifice. It was his disciples who attended, and Janmejaya treated them as equal to and representatives of Veda Vyasa. Some even go on to challenge the English translation of the text itself, because there are many words which are impossible to translate in English, so scholars ascribe the closest possible words in English. These, of course, are all wild speculations and not the point of this podcast. As said before, the focus of this podcast is not on the authenticity of the events, but describing the events as they are described in the text itself. So let's move on. So Veda Vyasa is now in the ceremony, and Janmejaya asks him that given he has witnessed the conflict between Kauravas and Pandavas, he would really like to hear the story in detail from the composer himself. Veda Vyasa agrees and instructs one of his disciples named Vaishampayana to narrate the story, exactly as he had heard it from him. Why Veda Vyasa does not do it himself? The Parva does not tell us. Vaishampayana begins in the usual way, bowing to his guru Veda Vyasa and then to the king. He begins to narrate the story, but again he only gives a summary. That summary, as it is presented in the Parva, is quite good and covers the story of Kauravas and Pandavas and what gave rise to the conflict and eventually a full-blown war. But perhaps let's not discuss that summary, as we will go through the story in greater detail later in the upcoming episodes. When Vaishampayana is done with the summary, Janmejaya thanks him, but then also says that he is not entirely satisfied with such a brief account, and is rather interested in the detailed story. He essentially argues that a war at such a massive scale between Kauravas and Pandavas must have been for a valid reason, and not because a few cousins just could not get along with each other. He also argues that if Pandavas were so brave, and the legends that he has heard are true, then why did they tolerate so much humiliation before engaging into a decisive war? They could have just had a small battle and easily overpowered their cousins. Why did they keep on tolerating the wrongdoings of their cousins? What he meant by this was that he actually wanted to hear the story as it happened, to understand the behavior of different characters in the story and what events led to such a massive conflict. Vaishampayana agrees to narrate the story in its entirety. As a usual disciple would do, he starts with the praise of his guru and his seminal work in the form of this Mahabharata epic. He shares his conclusion on the work, noting that it is equivalent to 5th Veda. It has various emotions, rules of what to do and what not to do, tales of greatness and of dilemma. He mentions that the great Veda Vyasa composed it over the course of 3 years. Finally, he concludes with a famous quote from this text. Whatever is found in this text on the fourfold objectives of human existence may be found elsewhere. But whatever is not found cannot be found elsewhere. And this is then the tagline of this podcast as well. Whatever does not exist in it cannot exist. Anyways, let's get back to Vaishampayana. Vaishampayana begins with the story of a very ancient sage which he says belongs to Kuru lineage. The name of that king was Uparichar, but he was also known by the name of Vasu or Vasu. So we will use the name Vasu in our discussion. Vasu is described as brave and righteous king who conquers the kingdom of Chedi. But soon he gives up warfare and retires to forest to begin austerities. Lord Indra, however, assumes that the reason he is engaged in austerities is because he wants to acquire Indra's throne. So he goes to see the king and convinces him that his duty lies in ruling over the kingdom of Chedi and making sure he serves his people rather than living the life of a hermit. He even gives him exclusive ownership of a magnificent flying chariot and a garland. The garland would make Vasu or Vasu invincible against all known weapons. Perhaps it is some kind of an armor. This is a friendly conversation between Vasu and Indra in which Indra manages to convince him to give up his austerities and resume his royal duties. Following this conversation, Vasu is extremely pleased. He even initiates special worship for Lord Indra, which later, as the Parva tells us, becomes a tradition. The Parva further tells us that Vasu had 5 sons who establish their separate dynasties and are extremely powerful and successful kings. There isn't much detail about these sons except their names. We also hear that at one time the Lord of Mountains attacked the goddess of river out of lust, and then Vasu intervenes to save the river from the mountain. The river gives birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The boy is made a general in the army of Vasu, whereas the girl is married to him. This new wife of Vasu is extremely beautiful. When she was in her right season for birth, Vasu wanted to make love to her, but he was compelled to go for hunting. Although he went, but the excitement to mate with his new wife was so great that he discharged his semen in the forest. But because his wife was in the right season, he wanted to make sure that her period does not go waste. So he collected his semen on a leaf and attempted to dispatch it to his wife through a bird courier, precisely through a hawk. But then the hawk is attacked en route by another hawk and the semen falls into the river, which is then swallowed by a fish. As a result, the river gives birth to twins, a boy and a girl, and both are brought before King Vasu. The boy, as he grows up, becomes a king famous by the name of Matsya, which literally means fish, whereas the girl comes to be known as Satyavati. She, however, is given to the fishing tribe as their daughter. The girl was born out of fish, and perhaps that's why she always smelled of a fish, and she didn't like it. As she grew up, she began to run a small ferry boat where she helped passengers cross the river. Then one day she met a sage by the name of Parashara as he was in her boat. The sage was completely taken over by the immense beauty of Satyavati. He wanted to make love to her and openly proposed this to Satyavati. At first she was hesitant, but the thought of being a mother to the son of such a powerful sage made her agree. However, there are people on both sides of the river and they could clearly see what was happening inside the boat. She pointed this to the sage and also said that how could she maintain her virginity after bearing a child from him. The sage assures her that even after the intercourse and bearing a son from him, she would keep her virginity, and he would also grant her any additional boons of her desire. Satyavati was fed up with the smell of the fish that dominated her personality. She asked the sage that she should forever smell of sweet scents. The sage grants the boon, and then the powerful sage Parashara creates a fog that covers the entire boat so the couple could make love. From Satyavati and Parashara is born a magnificent son and is named Krishna. He was born on an island, so he becomes famous by the name of Krishna Dvaipyana. And later, through the extreme austerity and study of Vedas, including his seminal work on classification of Vedas, he comes to be known as Krishna Dvaipyana Veda Vayasa. He doesn't live with his mother though, and at a very young age leaves to become a hermit. Vaishampayana, having narrated the story of how Vyasa was born, then narrates how other characters in the Mahabharata story were born. For example, birth of Bhishma, Drona, Kripa and Karna. We won't spend any time discussing this part of the Parva because it is laid in quite a detail in the later sections of the text and will be covered in upcoming episodes. But on hearing the description of these characters, Janmejaya wanted to know as to why these were born in the first place. Some characters had special births, such as Karna and the 5 Pandava brothers. Some were born through sacrificial fire, such as wife of the Pandavas and her brother. Some were innumerable in number, for example 100 sons of Dhritarashtra and so on. So this perhaps suggested to Janmejaya that gods must have planned these births through right medium or at right times for a higher purpose. And perhaps that's why he wanted to know why these were born in the first place. In response to this question, Vaishampayana narrates to him the story of Parshuram. If you recall, we covered this story in episode 2. This Parva notes that after Parshuram concludes his expedition of massive and brutal war against Kshatriyas, there are only a handful of Kshatriyas left in the world. Their entire race is almost at the verge of extinction. Therefore, in order to gain their lost numbers, many of the Kshatriyas' women seek help from Brahmins to impregnate them. Vaishampayana tells us that this new generation of Kshatriyas was unlike the previous generation, which was corrupt and power-hungry. When the kingdoms were re-established, their focus shifted towards the general welfare of the citizens rather than warfare and land grabbing. A lot is described in this Parva as to how the world looks like post this Parshuram episode, but in summary, this was a happy, prosperous and orderly society that worked strictly according to dharma as it was known at that time. However, this peace and order did not continue forever, as various demons, after having been dislocated from heavens, began to be born on earth. A significant number were born as kings and rulers, and they were cruel as hell. They oppressed people, engaged in unnecessary warfare, were brutal to their subjects, and engaged in corrupt practices. In other words, the society was again tormented and disordered. Mother Earth, the goddess, was traumatized seeing all this happening and therefore sought redemption from Brahma. Lord Brahma suggested that all the gods should be born on earth at various times and places and should begin to engage with demons in human form. The gods agree, and so does, on Indra's request, the mighty Lord Vishnu. This Parva ends here. Again, not much into the main story. But the good news is that the popular characters of the story, such as Veda Vyasa and his mother Satyavati, have at least been introduced. The next Parva is Sambhav Parva. It is quite substantial, perhaps more than twice the size of Astika Parva that we covered in previous episodes. It is in the Sambhav Parva that the story begins to take shape, so stay tuned. I hope you liked today's episode, and if so, please do not forget to like, subscribe and share. And yes, please leave me a comment or drop me an email if you have any questions, comments or feedback. The email is provided in the description. With that, we will end this here and I will see you in the next episode. Until then, goodbye and take care.